As of November 13, 2020, the value of the pension fund amounted to more than 1,077,000,000 Georgian lari. The number of registered citizens has exceeded 1,086,560 people benefited already from the pension.
The number of people involved in the pension scheme is growing daily and has averaged more than 12,500 over the last 3 months. Pension savings have already accrued benefits of up to 102 million Georgian lari. Retirement assets are placed at an effective 11.1% per annum.
Wages up to 750 Georgian lari in the private sector were exempt from income tax for 6 months from May the 1st, 2020. As for the wages up to 1,500 Georgian lari, first 750 lari will be exempt from income tax. This change has saved employers a maximum of 150 Georgian lari per month on employees' salaries. The program ended in October.
The state-owned Georgian Oil and Gas Corporation will build a new 272-megawatt thermal power plant for $174.8 million USD. The corporation will sign a contract with Turkish company Şalik Energy for construction of the thermal power plant.
Yield on Armenia's Eurobond was down by 80 basic points over 5 to 12 November, while Azerbaijan's Eurobond narrowed by 53 basic points in the same period. Notably, Georgia's sovereign Eurobond was among the top performers, with the yield down 51 basic points to 2.16% by 12th of November. Turkey was another winner of the week with improved investors' sentiments. Yield on sovereign Eurobond dropped by 123 basic points to a 2-month low of 3%. Investors are hopeful that the appointments of Naci Akbal as governor of Central Bank of Turkey and Lafti Elvan as the new finance minister signal a shift away from unorthodox policy.
In the region, the most important news of the week was a ceasefire agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Although the issue on the entire disputed region was not resolved, the peace deal is perceived positively by investors. Not surprisingly, Armenia's sovereign Eurobond was one of the top performers of the week. With a ceasefire agreement among Armenia and Azerbaijan and reduced risk sentiment in the Caucasus, yields on the regional Eurobonds declined last week.
According to the Prime Minister of Georgia, Giorgi Khacharia, it seems that the intensity of expectations for the second wave of the coronavirus was not fully assessed. However, Prime Minister highlights that lockdowns are being announced in the countries of the world. Countries with good economies and strong healthcare are finding it difficult to deal with the situation.
It was not difficult to convince the IMF because the IMF is a very rational organization, especially during crisis. Finance Minister of Georgia, Ivan Machavariani, answered BM.G's question on how the government managed to convince the IMF to alter the main macroeconomic parameters.
So this is the Checkpoints, hosted and co-authored by Elena Kvangilashvili and myself. I'm Georgi Sakadze. On Sunday evening, we will be telling you all about this week of economy and business.
Yes, it's Sunday, 10 p.m., and it's time to look at some main developments in Georgian and global business and economy and what some meaningful factors that have a powerful impact.
So let us start with the main figures for Georgia that have been unveiled by the International Monetary Fund this week. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a major impact on Georgia's economy. The shock is expected to cause a contraction of 5% in GDP in 2020, 1 percentage point greater than projected at the same time of the sixth review, on account of a more negative impact of the lockdown and a more protracted shock. IMF staff led by Mercedes Vera Martin stated in an official release which was issued after the conclusion of the virtual review mission to Georgia.
Growth is expected to rebound to 4.3% in 2021 as the pandemic fades effects, but with considerable downside risks to the outlook, reads the statement issued by Mercedes Vera Martin after a virtual review mission of the IMF. According to the International Monetary Fund, the revision in the 2021 growth outlook from 5%, the October 2020 World Economic Outlook, is attributed to the uncertainty associated with the regional conflict and the increased COVID-19 cases in Georgia.
The fund believes that the 2021 budget continues to appropriately support the recovery while laying the groundwork for fiscal consolidation, and the deficit is projected at 7.6% of GDP next year, and the current account deficit expected to widen to 9.7% of GDP in 2020 from 5.4% in 2019.
The IMF staff welcomed the authorities' commitment to medium-term fiscal sustainability as directed by Georgia's fiscal rule, which will bring the fiscal deficit under 3% of GDP and public debt under 60% of GDP by 2023. This is also written in the official statement of the IMF staff. And in terms of a public debt, this is a very interesting phrase to me, which I had a chance to ask head of the International Monetary Fund, the Middle East and Central Asia Department mission, Mercedes Vera Martin. What happens before 2023? Does the IMF envision the debt level to cross the 60% threshold? Here is an excerpt from the exclusive interview. Current account deficit will reach 9.7% of GDP, and fiscal deficit is also rising. How did the government assure you, Ms. Martin, that this is not a stretch for a quite poor country like Georgia and in such tough situation? And not only Georgia, also global economy, since we're talking about Georgia, that is a small economy, it's open economy, it's very interdependent on what's going on around it.
Yes, that's a very good question. So we have, Georgia is a small open economy vulnerable to external shocks. So when we were assessing the impact of the shock on the Georgian economy, we were expecting a widening in the current account deficit, mainly because travel stops, and Georgia is a tourism-dependent economy. It has been a great source of growth in the last years, and with social distancing and the ban on international flights, there was no other way that tourism coming to a standstill, and that is going to have an impact. I have to say at the same time that the impact on the current account deficit has been milder than what we originally projected, in part because there have been an adjustment in the trade balance. Import growth had remained subdued because of domestic demand, and that has compensated more than the slowdown that we have seen in export growth. And remittances have also sustained the levels. Actually, they have been doing relatively well, and they are growing year on year by single digits, but it's still growing. We didn't expect that when we first thought about the impact of the shock. So there is a widening in the current account deficit, and what we are seeing is that it has generated additional external financing needs. In response to that, we augmented the IMF program, we provided more financing, and the authorities have been able to mobilize also donor financing from other multilateral and bilateral institutions. I think in terms of the widening of the deficit, the message we have been giving globally to our membership is, if you have fiscal space, use it, because the shock is so unprecedented that you want to limit the impact in the economy and in socially, so that when the pandemic fades, your recovery becomes quicker. So there are trade-offs about what you can do now and what you will have in the future. And I think it's important to recognize that Georgia has been in this position, that have been able to to mobilize finance. It has fiscal space to widen the deficit. And of course, this cannot be maintained on a permanent basis, because then you will face a challenge with fiscal sustainability. But there is a Georgian fiscal rule that also tells the authorities, okay, you can deviate from your fiscal parameters on a temporary basis when you are in an emergency situation, and it also tells you how you have to go back. So in terms of fiscal sustainability, we know that the deficit has to be 3% of GDP, the debt has to be 60% of GDP by 2023.
That is a very interesting phrase. I have also noted down that phrase when you say that public debt under 60% of GDP by 2023. What does that mean? Do you envision that this debt at some point might overcome the 60% threshold?
So we are projecting that the public debt, gross public debt, and I'm going to elaborate on that, gross public debt will reach 62% next year. And this is driven by two elements. The first one, 3/4 of the public debt is denominated in foreign exchange, mostly in dollars and euros, and the depreciation of the lari increased the level of the debt. Then the second element is that the financing that have been mobilized by the authorities in order to respond to the shock. So there is a higher contraction of the debt in 2020 and in 2021. So debt is projected at 62% in 2021. By 2022, we are projecting that the public debt will be below 60% already. And one thing to note here is that, the increase in the debt doesn't fully translate in increasing spending. I mean, the government is also building deposits.
500 million in Eurobonds. Has the Ministry of Finance indicated in any way how they are going to deal with it and how they are going to refinance it?
So this is a 500 million euro bond that is maturing in 2021. At the moment, the plans of the authorities is to roll it over. That will help to build fiscal buffers and also preserve external buffers in case downside risk materialize.
You mentioned that there is quite uncertainty that this debt might translate into spending right away or not, and be left in the deposits. So this is also some kind of pressure on lari and the exchange rate, which in turn increases the debt as well. In the statement that you issued, I read a very interesting phrase. You said, keeping inflationary expectations anchored may call for tightening the monetary policy stance should pressures on lari exchange rate feed into expectations. Right now, what we are seeing is that inflation is coming down on the one hand. On the other hand, we see that NBG is still selling reserves, and on the third hand, we see that it is reluctant from easing the monetary policy. So very tough situation to say the least. What is more important at this stage? Stability of lari and the exchange rate, or the inflation?
So let me start by recognizing it's a very challenging situation.
Yes.
But we have to keep in mind that the monetary framework of Georgia is inflation targeting. So
yes, of course.
And the floating
in this situation.
Yes, and the floating exchange rate regime has been working well for Georgia, because as a small open economy that is vulnerable to external shock, the exchange rate is helping to protect the economy from that shock.
Yes,
I mean, of course, I understand that people and households and companies, business who have borrowed in dollars are facing some pressures or reduced capacity to the burden on repaying those liabilities is increasing with the lari depreciation. But the fact that the lari adjusts is overall a positive development for the Georgian economy. Then the intervention of the central bank is more to limit the volatility rather than to stabilize the exchange rate. So you don't want an exchange rate that is too volatile, because volatility is also not good for the economy. So I think at the moment the challenge is you want inflationary expectations to remain well anchored around the 3% target of the central bank. And there are two elements here. One is the demand in the domestic economy that remains weak, and that is not putting pressures on inflation, right? So as long as the demand remains subdued, we will not see pressures on the exchange, on inflationary expectations coming from demand. It's not an economy that has inflation because of demand pressure, overheating in the economy. Actually, we have estimated a negative output gap that will only close in 2022. The second element that it drives inflation dynamics in Georgia is the exchange rate dynamics. And of course, a nominal effective depreciation of the exchange rate impact inflation because of the pass-through. And there is a rapid pass-through between exchange rate and inflation dynamics. So the MBG, in keeping the policy rates with a little bit of what we call a tightening bias, is helping to anchor those inflationary expectations in light of the recent depreciation of the lari, so that it doesn't fit into inflation. And what we are projecting is that inflation will actually converge to the 3% target by the end of 2021.
Thank you, Elena, for the very interesting insights from the exclusive interview. And let us tell our viewers that they have to stay tuned after the checkpoints ends today, since we will be airing the full 45 minutes of the exclusive interview that you have conducted with the head of the IMF Middle East and Central Asia Department Mission, head Mercedes Vera Martin. My warmest regards and best wishes to her and the IMF team working on Georgia's case.
Well, best wishes taken. Thank you, Georgi. It is definitely worth a watch. And since our last point with Mercedes was lari depreciation, let us take off from that point and try to answer the question that has definitely a political connotation, but has been a very open topic recently for post-election speculations in Georgia.
I agree. The situation currently in Georgia is that the opposition is not accepting the election results and hits the streets from the time to time in peaceful protest. We hear from different people, groups, institutions that these protests translate into lari depreciation on the market. But is it true?
Thanks, Georgi, for asking this question. Our journalist, Anna Tabadze, decided to answer this question by looking at the history of lari depreciation when there was a mass protest going on in the country, and while being an additional factor to the formation of expectations, maybe we will see that mass protests cannot be named as a leading factor, of course.
Well, it's high time. It's high time to see what figures tell us that. And we have Anna Tabadze who reports all this.
Georgian Finance Minister Ivane Machavariani claimed that the sharp, leaping depreciation of the lari in the recent week had been caused by protests launched by the opposition after the parliamentary elections of 2020. We declare with full responsibility that the depreciation of the lari stems from the radicalism that is taking place in the country, the minister said. According to him, there is no other objective reason for the lari's depreciation at the moment. The statement has raised different views among economists and experts. The Checkpoints has looked at the archive of Georgian lari's exchange rate against the US dollar during the largest mass protests and revolution that has taken place in Georgia. Exchange rate of lari during the 2003 Rose Revolution, which ended with the change of power in Georgia. The protests started on November 3 and ended on November 23rd. The cost of lari stood at $2.10 US as of November 3, 2003. 2 weeks from the beginning of mass protests, it reached 2.22 on November 23rd. So as the data shows, lari has dropped by only 0.12 towards US dollar. Let's look at the exchange rate of lari during the anti-government protests of November 2007. November 2007 is frequently called the worst political crisis in Georgia in the past decade. Meanwhile, anti-government protests carried no impact over the exchange rate of lari, which during the whole month of November 2007 stood at 1.62 against US dollar. Exchange rate of lari under mass rally against President Saakashvili in 2009. 1 lari was 1.69 US dollar on April 9 on the first day of demonstration in Georgia. The rate tendency downgraded and reached 1.64 on the peak of the rally on May 26. Georgia had numerous mass protests before the parliamentary elections of 2012, when the opposition, headed by Bidzina Ivanishvili, was rallying against Mikhail Saakashvili. But for the whole month of September 2012, $1 US was worth 1.65 lari. In June of 2019, a diplomatic incident involving Russian MP Sergei Gavrilov caused widespread civil protests in Georgia. The situation was amplified by the force that was used against protesters. Throughout the summer of 2019, Georgia had political instability, and the lari was depreciating. Members of the Georgian government said that the depreciation was due to the civil protests, but in reality, Georgian lari started depreciating a month earlier before the protests started. To sum up, the archive data of lari clearly shows that the street protests are the last factor to be blamed for the depreciation of the lari, more so today when the worldwide pandemic poses a clear threat to financial instability and serves as a fundamental factor for lari depreciation.
On the background of Georgia's parliamentary elections 2020, there was another, this time presidential elections 2020, that needed to be watched closely, and it still needs, by the way.
Yes. And these are the U.S. presidential elections. Joe Biden is set to be the 46th president of the United States of America. He knows Georgia well and even appreciates Georgian wine.
And how do we know that? We found a man whose wine is probably in the collection of Mr. Biden's wines. Meet the winemaker who is our bridge to the U.S. after the presidential elections.
They congratulate him on President-elect Biden's victory. Why? Here's the answer in these shots. During his stay in Tbilisi in 2009, the then vice president and now the U.S. president-elect tasted Georgian wine. They asked Biden to choose wine for dinner, and he directly chose Beroza's wine. The main toast was also served with this wine at the official dinner. Beroza didn't know anything about it at the time. When people came to buy his wine, he sold Katsiteli and Tsoanev Velistsiche for 1.5 lari and only asked the consumers not to spill his wine in plastic containers. Now he knows that the wine will be bottled in honor of Joe Biden and called Bidenuri. He plans to send it to the president-elect by Biden's inauguration. However, the story of Beroza's wine began a little earlier when Sakstandard closed and he was left unemployed. That's what should have happened, he says. I was ashamed to go to the entrepreneur. There was so much regulation and the wine was still falsified. He's a descendant of winemakers. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were also winemakers. He took upon winemaking and made sure that the number doubled in the second year and went up to 100 tons. Now a 15-year-old Irakli, small Beroza, enters the cellar. This cellar, and that one of the Avalishvilis, ages 200 years. Today, everyone serves the descendants like when Sandro Valiashvili used to produce 30 tons of wine from his own vineyard. In the spring of 2009, the Minister of Economy packaged, bottled, and advertised Beroza's wine for free. Beroza wines were made entirely as a gift. He says it was both help and motivation. Beroza wines also began to spread abroad. Once it was discovered by an American man interested in wine. This wine has brought the American to Georgia. He even took 2,500 bottles of wine from here. Berez's wine has also reached Germany. Now, if anything stands out as an obstacle as the coronavirus, tourism has stopped and so has his shop. But he knows that no wine will be left in his cellar. He still has a lot to do. He wants to create a small vineyard where he will cultivate old and unknown varieties.
But this is not all about the elections in the country, which is the strategic partner of our country, Georgia.
Georgi, it was very wise of you to specify which Georgia you're referring to. We also ABC's coverage of elections in the U.S. state Georgia, where our main avenue, Chavchavadze Avenue, came into the spotlight.
It was definitely very funny to see 55th public school in ABC's report. It made me laugh a lot.
Yeah, well, not only you. This was something we laughed about in the upcoming interview with David Kramer on U.S. Georgia elections and more. Did you think that Joe Biden would become the 46th president of the United States of America?
I did think he would win. I didn't think it would be as close as it was, although at the end of the process, he will likely win by more than 5 million votes. And he may wind up with as many electoral college votes, which is how we decide the outcome of our elections, as Donald Trump got in 2016. The Republicans in the House gained some seats, and the Republicans in the Senate might hold on to their majority. We'll have to wait until the two elections in Georgia, the state, not the country, in early January.
Yes, it was really funny. Did you see those videos on ABC where ABC was stating that Georgia went to elections in Georgia and there was Tbilisi, Georgia.
How was that right? the wrong footage.
Right on Chavchavadze Avenue. It was quite.
That's pretty funny. Good.
It was quite funny.
Well, Georgia is on our mind. Let's put it that way.
Definitely. So, what does Biden's presidency mean to the U.S. globally and to Georgia as well?
I think a Biden presidency will be a return to some sense of normalcy, to some sense of predictability, to a more traditional foreign policy, for better or worse. However, that he is going to have tremendous challenges facing him, starting with the pandemic here in the United States. And I know that's a big problem in your country as well, but it's a huge problem here.
So what is your opinion there? What mark did COVID-19 leave on elections? Because it has left its mark both in the U.S. and in Georgia.
It has, and it's a challenge for every country. Here in the United States, I would say the problem has been a total neglect on the part of President Trump and his administration. He keeps saying we are rounding the corner, meaning that he thinks it is behind us, it is in the past, when in fact we are setting new records every day. And so I think his gross mishandling of the pandemic did contribute to his defeat. The economic situation contributed to his defeat. But I think a lot of Americans, and let's be clear, President Trump got a huge number of people who voted for him. He got more people who voted for him this time in defeat than he got voted for him in victory in 2016. But I think more Americans who voted decided they've had enough.
Do you think Biden's presidency also means stricter approach to pandemic, meaning some kind of lockdowns, everything that the rest of the Europe and Georgia also have experienced?
I don't know if we'll see a national lockdown. I do expect, however, that a new President Biden will lead by example by wearing a mask all the time. President Trump, for some reason that I simply don't understand to this day, politicized the issue of wearing a mask and essentially encourage people not to wear them.
Let me read out loud to you what one of the leading investment banks in Georgia wrote in its official recent review, what is possible if Mr. Biden wins the presidency. So what TBC wrote is that if Biden wins, it is possible for the U.S. to continue disputes with China, but with more predictability, restrain from imposing tariffs on EU and other advanced economies, impose stricter measures to contain COVID-19, which we already spoke about, have higher fiscal spending on social policy, green initiatives and infrastructure, most probably leading to an increase in taxes, return to U.S. leadership globally with more international cooperation, more support to NATO, and stronger push against Russia. Does that seem accurate?
I think that is a good summary. The part about taxes, though, to be clear, at least during the campaign, candidate Biden said the increase in taxes would only apply to those who make more than $400,000 a year. So that does not mean the average citizen, just to put that in perspective. I think we will treat our allies and our friends as allies and friends. President Trump, in my view, has not done so. I think we will respect the European Union as an entity that has done much more good than harm. And we will recognize NATO as the most successful military alliance over the past 7 decades in preserving the peace on a European continent that has seen far too much bloodshed. And I hope that the Biden administration will continue a policy, to be fair, that Vice President Mike Pence stated when he visited Tbilisi in the summer of 2017, that the United States continues to support Georgia's membership in NATO. We also, I think, will continue to support Georgia's membership in the European Union. We're not a member of the European Union, so we have no real say in that matter. But I think that the United States will increase its support for Georgia and Ukraine, for the people of Belarus, not the regime, for the people of other countries in the region that are struggling for democracy and human rights. And I don't think you will see President Biden have any reluctance to criticize Russia's Vladimir Putin, as President Trump has shown for the past, not just 4 years, but including when he was a candidate. And I do think that we will see a tougher approach toward Russia than we have seen in the past. And I hope that applies to Russia's creeping annexation in Georgia and continued occupation of Georgian territory as well. Georgia often gets forgotten when there is talk about sanctions, because there had been no sanctions imposed after Russia's invasion in 2008, and yet Russia occupies 20% of Georgian territory for all intents and purposes. So I hope there will be more attention focused there.
Do you follow the events that are unfolding in Georgia?
Yes,
What is your
yes,
take
with
on
great
that?
concern. Georgia can't afford, the country cannot afford to have this chaos and this tension in the country. The Georgian dream has tried to portray the reaction of the international community to the elections as very positive, and it wasn't very positive. It praised certain parts of it. It said fundamental freedoms were respected. But there are some serious allegations of irregularities, and people have a right to protest peacefully. Now, I underscore the word peacefully, but the use of water cannons on protesters in Tbilisi in front of the Central Election Commission came without a warning, and that risks heightening tensions and escalating the situation rather than calming it down. I also think that the opposition is quite dug in, and it has indicated it plans to boycott the parliament and boycott the recounts. I don't know if that's the right position or not, and it's not for me to judge, but usually participating in these processes is the best way, but I understand the frustration. So I think Georgian Dream needs to understand it needs to find some compromise. The opposition needs to find some compromise. The only people who are benefiting from the current tensions and turmoil in Georgia right now are in Moscow, not in Tbilisi.
And lastly, just to summarize our conversation, I would like to hear from you how democracy on the one hand and economic prosperity, so to say, on the other, are interrelated.
There's no question that of all the systems that exist and have existed, democracy is the best system. It is not perfect. We see this here in the United States where we have problems. We're the oldest democracy in the world, and we have gone through some huge problems here in this country. But we have also shown that our institutions are strong and resilient. And the Chinese model is not a model to follow. Russia is not a model to follow. And when we see people in the streets in Kyrgyzstan or in Ukraine or in Belarus or in Georgia, we should appreciate that these people are out there demanding greater respect for human rights, demanding better from their government, an end to corruption, a more democratic system. Polarization is a huge problem in the United States. It's a huge problem in Georgia.
As well.
As Joe Biden said on Saturday evening, we have to recognize that our opponents are not our enemies, as he phrased it here. Our opponents are also Americans. In Georgia, the same thing. Georgia, whether you're in government or out of government, your opponents are not your enemies. They're still Georgians.
Thank you so much, and thank you for taking time and answering our questions.
I'm glad we were able to schedule this, Elena.
And to summarize our coverage of U.S.-Georgia current reality, we should also mention that Mike Pompeo is set to visit Georgia on November 17th. What we know is that Mike Pompeo will meet with Prime Minister Giorgi Gakharia, President Salome Zurabishvili, Foreign Minister David Zalkaliani, and His Holiness and Beatitude Ilya II.
According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Georgia, Mike Pompeo's visit will once again show that the U.S. reaffirms its strong support for Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity, its democratic development and European Euro-Atlantic aspirations, and that will also prove that the United States and Georgia's strategic ties and partnerships are strong, and the countries are ready to make them even stronger.
Yes, Georgi, the ministry said that at the planned high-level meetings, the parties will discuss the country's top priorities with the United States Georgia Charter on strategic partnership and prospects of further developing their relations in various fields, and also focus on the issue of cooperation between the countries in the region of the South Caucasus.
Currently, this is a very troubled region due to Nagorno-Karabakh war and the ceasefire, which is still to be seen what impact it will have on Georgia. And there are many different views on this impact.
Yes, we will be presenting just one such opinion right now. Tbilisi Capital, our loyal partner in the checkpoints, will be represented by its chief economist, Otar Nadaraya, and we will focus exactly on the potential impacts you have just mentioned. Nagorno-Karabakh and the events that unfolded just a couple of days ago, when we see that there is a ceasefire and some even claim that the war has ended at this point at least. So what impact this might have on Georgia's economy?
Hopefully we don't have any more casualties, at least in the near term. Of course, this is a tragedy from both sides. Now, on the economic impact on Georgia, of course, Azerbaijan and Armenia are both very important, Georgia's very important economic partners. Recently, the dependence, I would call, went down because of tourism, because tourism is already, unfortunately, close to zero. But of course, we have a number of other exposures, and also in baseline scenario, especially take into account good news on vaccine, we hope on tourism recovery starting gradually from the second half of 2021. So the ceasefire is important and certainly will impact Georgia positively from this perspective. It's very important also to consider the so-called transit role of Georgia. So there are talks that in the medium to long term, there might be some issues there, but still I would also think about upside.
Just to be clear, so that our viewers also follow our conversation.
Yes.
So you mean the fact that Azerbaijan now has the direct border with Turkey. So that's the main part when we are.
Yes, definitely. Also, so thanks for the clarification. Also, if there is, normalization in relations between Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey, of course, again, chances are low. Unfortunately, I should say, definitely for this. So. The transit route might be even different, directly crossing Armenia. But at the moment, certainly, I agree with you. That's the most important thing to consider. But again, overall, the normalization in the regions, I mean, the relations between countries in South Caucasus, I strongly believe. Will benefit all countries, including Georgia. Yeah. So this is very strong upside. Yes.
Yeah, probably you have seen that map. I don't know whether that's real or not, but it's definitely arousing some doubts and seeing the risks, because you can see how Georgia gets surrounded by Russian peacekeepers because of the Russian peacekeepers on the territory where there were no peacekeepers before. So what does this bring to the tensions that we have with Russia, and how that relates then to the investment potential in this country, to the political risks, so to say, that are also weighing while deciding whether or not to invest in Georgia.
Yes.
See that FDI will be very important thing in order to shrink the deficit that will be widening very significantly, so to say. So, what is your take on that?
Yes, thank you. This is a very important question. Yes, there are many views that Russia has strengthened its role in the South Caucasus, and the presence now is higher. Another question I would say is about Turkey, because again, as you know, Russia announced that the peacekeepers would be only from Russia, but Turkey announced that also they would participate in this process. So I would say at the moment it's not entirely clear, what would be the balance there in terms of Turkey and Russia. I would not say that this would impact really what you can call really materially negatively the investment climate in Georgia. Probably because again the tense relations with Russia, I would say to a large extent are already priced in, and now those new developments. I would not say that those alone would be significant driver to change the appetite.
Yes,
towards Georgia.
Yes, and my last question in this Georgia's transit role. One thing that pops up to mind is definitely the deep sea port and Anaklia and the other roads that we could be using for kind of like strengthening our role as a transit country. Do you think now there is time to think in that direction as well. And does Anaklia Port, deep sea port, gain more relevance than we thought before?
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. If you ask me, to name a few really strategic initiatives for Georgia, I would say certainly this deep sea project is one of them. Also, I would add this is also, in my view, this is also very important from the urbanization point of view, because again, the project is not only about the deep sea port, but also
it's about the city as well, the smart city.
Yes. So this is very important, and this is, I would say, really something what people call the 21st century idea. So we need those kind of ideas, to move forward.
Definitely. And you know that next week Mike Pompeo will be visiting Georgia. Do you think that would also kind of mitigate those risks that we were mentioning, especially in this political context that you said are already weighed in, but still need to be
Yes, I agree.
From time to time?
Yes, I agree. Definitely, yes. I mean, definitely. This is the indication. What I would say is that we are on the map, and basically Georgia is important. Well, of course. So one question is that you have again very likely the change in leadership in U.S. So probably for decisions, maybe we have to wait a bit, but still this is very important, and this is again clear message that U.S. is Georgia's strategic partner.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nadaraj. It was a very interesting talk. Thank you.
And at the odds of all challenges stemming from different sources, we still have success stories in business in Georgia.
First, Georgian depository notes from Silknet, something that this type of company has never done on this market before. Salome Metswarishvili reports.
Revenue of 387 million lari, 31% share in the fixed internet market, 34% in the mobile communications and broadcasting transit segment, 55% share in the fixed phone market. These are company Silknet's main numbers. Innovative offers are the signature of Silknet. The company never slows down. As a result, for the first time in history, Silknet issues public depository notes which anyone can purchase. Let's explain what that entails. If you want to become the owner of one of the largest company's securities in Georgia, you no longer need to have a lot of money. For $1,000, you can become an indirect owner of Silknet Eurobonds and get benefits for it. Silknet has a lucrative offer. If you have money and think about making a worthy investment, Georgian depository notes are a good option. The amount invested by you will be accrued at an annual interest rate of 11%. At the same time, you will be able to trade securities on the Georgian Stock Exchange through financial intermediaries. Those who have savings in dollars or are afraid of the depreciation of the lari can buy Eurobond and receive 5.5% of the invested amount as accrued interest. 11% per year is much more than any bank deposit in Georgia. Depository notes are securities that in this case are tied to the $200 million worth of Eurobonds issued by Silknet in 2019. Eurobonds are traded on the Irish Stock Exchange. However, you need at least $200,000 to trade on the International Stock Exchange. Silknet is introducing a new product to remove this barrier. TBC Capital assists the company in these processes. The general public and other identified investors in Georgia are interested in Eurobonds but are unable to participate due to a $200,000 regulation. Silknet decided to issue certificates of deposit in response to this problem. Any interested investor in Georgia will become the indirect owner of this Eurobond for $1,000. No precedent has been set for the issuance of public depository notes in Georgia yet. Therefore, the National Bank had to create a legislative framework. Now everything is ready. The Minister of Finance asserts that Silknet's decision might have a spillover effect on other companies. The emergence of new financing instruments in the market is important for the development of the economy. Silknet decided to create an additional tool. We believe that this process should be further established in the market. In 2020, we have significantly renewed the regulatory and legal framework of securities and brought it closer to international standards. One of the directions was issues related to depository notes. Updated requirements have been developed in this regard. Despite COVID-19, Silknet has decided to issue public securities in 2020. The company believes that now is the right time because in parallel with the pension reform, Georgia's capital market is also advancing. The main priority now is for the local investors to capture this moment.
Very impressive indeed. And now let's dig deeper into the motivations of Silknet to take a totally new step by issuing first Georgian depository notes. CEO of Silk Road Bank, Ilya Enukashvili, sat down with the checkpoints.
First of all, thank you for your time. So Silknet has a great news. For the first time in history, company decided to issue depository notes. Let's tell us more about this, what the depository notes are, first of all, and why did the company choose this way, and why today when outside this COVID-19?
It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me. Yes, it's a historic moment actually, because the company Silknet is now issuing Georgian depository notes. It's actually a fresh term that was coined because depository notes are not commonly used, but this is a term where when a credit instrument is transported into a different jurisdiction and a different mechanism of investing in securities. So Silknet has successfully placed 200 million euro bonds about a year and a half ago. Natural demand for such issue was from foreign investors. Usually, local demand is a very important part for any issuance from an emerging market. Unfortunately, Georgia has a sketchy record of having capital markets and investors who want to buy securities. So we understood that in order to cultivate that demand for the future, and not for now, because for now, not a penny will go into Silknet's pockets, but for the future issuances and the development of the capital markets and the demand for other securities that the company may issue in the future, it is important to create instruments which will allow Georgian retail investors to get exposure to Georgian companies, in this case Silknet. The Eurobonds have a very peculiar feature whereby a minimum investment amount is $200,000. And this is by far not accessible to many Georgian retail investors. Even high net worth individuals in Georgia may find it difficult to invest such amounts of money. So that's why we decided to find an instrument that would allow a much lower threshold for investing. And we found the depository notes, and actually we developed a concept for this with the very active involvement of the National Bank of Georgia, which I would like to thank for this process, with the development of the concept and the documentation done by Dentons, that is Georgia and Dentons UK, and the very active participations from the Georgian Stock Exchange and the Central Depository. So with all these organizations playing along during the pandemic, using the Zoom, WebEx, and other means to collaborate remotely, we developed this essentially new security that mimics most of the rights and obligations of the existing Eurobonds and provides an indirect means of investing in the Eurobond.
And I would like to ask you about the rights of owners of these securities. Do they have some boundaries or something?
Well, we have to mention that we tried very, very hard to mimic all the rights that the investors usually have under the Eurobonds. So it's indirect. This is indirect ownership, but of course to the maximum extent practical, we try to give almost all the rights that the investors have. So we have to mention that the ownership is indirect again in the security, but all the protection, the payments, etc., are the ones that the Eurobonds provide.
Mm-hmm. And what is the motivation of Silknet? Because as I heard, Silknet will not attract any new investments by this issuance.
It's a purely cultivation of a local investor base that will be interested to buy single Silknet securities in the future. We just want to make sure that there is a wider number of investors who want and can invest in Silknet securities. It's as simple as that.
I think it will be great impact on developing Georgian capital market, but I want to hear it from you.
There's only a handful of instruments which are available right now. There are literally a handful of companies that issue bonds. We don't have equity market to speak about, and any new issuance is usually welcomed by investors. And even when we compare the size of the capital market in Georgia with the size of the deposits in the banks, there's a huge gap. And in order for the country and the economy to develop, it needs a functioning capital markets to have various means of financing companies and transforming savings into investments. And every new instrument that gives additional confidence and an additional means of investing should be welcome. And we hope that other companies will follow suit and not only Silknet, because anybody now can use a similar instrument to do that, and we hope that others will follow, and the number of investors who regularly invest in the market will grow.
And I will take the advantage of the occasion, and I want to ask you about the impact of pandemic on Silknet, because during this period was a really high demand on internet and other electronic services. How do you handle the challenges you face today and you faced during the lockdown and pandemic period?
We saw about 20-25% increase in fixed traffic. But especially important is the about 3 times higher mobile traffic that we saw during the pandemic, and this was handled essentially without a hiccup, thanks to the very massive investments that were done by Silknet since the acquisition of Geocell about 2 years ago in the mobile network, and the technological advantage that was taken by Silknet in the mobile network, which was confirmed by the drive tests that were done by the Georgian National Communication Commissions, which recognized Silknet's network as the fastest. And this was certainly not the case 2 years ago when Silknet acquired Geocell. So these investments allowed the company to provide a very good service to its customers and ensure that the much deeper digital life of our subscribers is handled. So whether it's Zoom conferences or school lessons or watching much more movies and series, etc., on any device, this was made possible by the much better network that the company has installed.
And what can you tell us about the company's future plans?
Well, Silknet plans to continue to invest in the future. So it was not only that the prior investments and prior capital expenditures allowed this traffic to go through and the service to be uninterrupted, but also during the pandemic, the investments have not stopped. And nothing was halted and nothing was postponed. On the contrary, the company doubled down on the investments and continues to roll out better and faster mobile network as well as fixed network. Also now Silknet is in the final stages of the so-called IT transformation, whereby huge IT systems are being replaced and modernized. So this builds a foundation for successful service of SilkNet subscribers in the future, introduction of new technologies, being faster on the market, and better cater to the demands of SilkNet subscribers. And of course, capital markets are very important in that, in ensuring that SilkNet has the capacity to invest in the future and have the kind of the technological advanced networks that it has now, and it will have in the future with all the advancements in the technology that take place as we speak.
This is just one example to me, Georgi, which can be quite motivational for those who are starting to do their own business in their early steps on the market. The Checkpoints is always ready to look for such businesses and tell you more and more on what's made in Georgia.
We're a timely business, by the way, which we'll be showcasing today. Face shields, face masks, these very essential products are now produced in Georgia by the company named Favorite, which used to be a polygraph company, but had to adjust the new realities that COVID-19 has brought to the world.
And managed to do that brilliantly, by the way. In just 24 hours, the enterprise was fully transformed, starting out with the face shields, then followed by face masks, and now the choice is various for consumers. There is one thing as well. 1 year ago, Favorite merged with the company Color Group.
Rusudan Chedlishvili and Mariam Mukhuguli will tell us more in a footage that Salome Chibashvili filmed for the Checkpoints.
Color Group and Favorite have been operating separately in the printing market for 25 years. 1 year ago, the companies merged. There were some services that Favorite had and Color Group didn't. By merging, we made our services even more diverse. We try not to lag behind the printing market trends. Recently, we added a textile enterprise where individual orders are received. We managed to transform the enterprise in exactly 24 hours. We started producing face shields. Today, a retail price of such shield is 5 lari. When buying in large quantities, price changes. We also made new masks for which we've brought round filters. These filters are replaceable and can be used for up to 10 days. The cost of fabric masks ranges from 5 to 9 lari. We always welcome healthy competition. Today, there is no other company on the market that offers a variety of services as we do. Having a one-stop shop for all services is a great comfort to our customers. Color and Favorite together employ about 500 people. We now have special offers for New Year's labels. If a customer orders a certain number of labels, greeting cards, gift bags will be given to them as a gift, depending on the size of the orders. Technological development is our priority. Next year, we plan to purchase new machines for label roll printing. We have a new project that aims to support small businesses, entrepreneurs, and startups. The project includes discounts on a variety of products. This project aims to break the stereotype that a large number of packages is needed to create a new brand. We have a different experience using HP technology, which eliminates additional costs. Our top priority is giving consumers a discounted price on the given product.
Georgi, today Mariam Adamian will bring up a name on the 30 under 30 list of a young woman who has been nominated on Forbes Georgia list for the second year in a row.
Yes, Lika Okhanashvili is just 29, and 3 years ago, she founded the consulting company, Key Consulting. One aim of the company is to popularize non-formal education in the country.
And Georgi, by the way, Key Consulting is also a very good example how it adapted to the COVID-19 reality, switching to online learning, and how the pandemic has not derailed its plans to reach out to the international partners.
Let's give the floor to Mariam Adamian's footage on Forbes Georgia's 30 under 30.
Key Consulting has been around for more than 3 years. During this period, our goal was to create a quality, non-formal education provider organization that would be able to engage people in a variety of trainings. First of all, there are teachers here, there are students here, there are different companies and company representatives here. It is fascinating that during this period, despite a lot of challenges and difficulties, we started with virtually zero resources and achieved the result that was intended. Tens of thousands of people are already involved in our organization's activities. They are undergoing training sessions. There are often cases when the same people come after one training and go through the second, third, fourth, and fifth trainings. Now we're moving in an international direction. We have already started negotiations with foreign organizations and schools. We are already holding international conferences with them. I think this is another step forward. In the field of education, it is tough to perceive competitors because each organization that operates contributes to the ultimate goal that probably any organization or any citizen should serve, and that is to raise the level of education. I think the more such organizations, the better the Georgian education system will be. Perhaps today an important problem is that although there are too many training organizations, there is no control over the direction of non-formal education as to who offers what training. If universities and schools need to be accredited, it would be good to accredit training centers in this regard so that the direction in which we conduct trainings would be controlled. I also advocate for having more scrutiny and ensuring that consumers will definitely receive a quality education. Prices for trainings are quite high on the market, although we are distinguished in this regard. We always offer a preferential and acceptable amount because the current income that most of the population has does not allow a person to pay half of its salary in training. The main thing now is that we are working towards having closer relations with other countries this year and sharing Georgian and foreign organizations' experiences, especially in the field of education.
And this is all for today. Well, almost all, since we still have something to show you. But it is definitely time to remind you that after the checkpoints ends, you can watch the exclusive interview in full with Mercedes Vero-Martin, since BM.G and Forbes.G is the space where you can find everything on local and global business and economy. So please follow us and leave your feedback.
And before you do that, take a look at what Forbes Georgia will offer you in November in its brand new edition. We'll be leaving you off with the short teaser and see you next Sunday by 10 p.m.
Gulf, the owner of the largest gas station in Georgia and the largest market player, is on a new path. Gulf Georgia has a new CEO. Craig Kramer brings more than 30 years of experience working in the oil field. In 3 years, Gulf has contributed 409 million lari to the budget in taxes and more than 2 million lari in charitable expenses. These numbers are constantly growing. What is the new CEO's signature management style? What does he expect from the new government? And what opportunities does he see in the future? Meet the new CEO in November's issue of Forbes Georgia. 4 continents, 22 countries, more than $1 billion market value, more than 7 million active customers, 50,000 courier partners, and up to 53 partner facilities. These are Glovo's main numbers. Giga Demetrashvili talks to Forbes Georgia about the company's plans and expectations. All commercial banks operating in Georgia have already submitted financial results for the 9 months of 2020 to National Bank of Georgia. According to them, the total assets of Georgian banks, despite the economic crisis, have increased by 80% annually and amount to 54 billion lari. Read more in this month's edition of Forbes Georgia. Does Georgia have a future in IT industry? Where is our country located on the IT map? Strategist President Anatoly Motkin answers the question. What is the price of change in energy and what news should we expect in 2021? Georgi Pangani, a member of the Georgian Energy and Water Supply Regulatory Commission, shares his views in author's column of Forbes Georgia. What should the new government look like for the economy to recover quickly and the country to progress? The answers can be found in an interview with Zaza Bibilashvili, a partner at the BGI law firm. Updated rankings of the 100 most profitable companies, private equity funds as an alternative source of funding, and many more in-depth insights into ongoing business and economic affairs in Georgia and abroad. Read this month's edition of Forbes Georgia.
Thank you for taking our question and for finding time for us in your very busy schedule. So Georgian authorities and the IMF reached the staff level agreement on the conclusion of the 7th review of the extended fund facility arrangement, which means that Georgia will get 112 million USD, of course, after it is approved by the IMF management and the executive board. What led you to this decision to conclude the review?
Thank you, Ellen. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. Well, you know, we have had a very long engagement with the Georgian authorities under the extended fund facility arrangement. This is part of our regular reviews, and progress under the review has been satisfactory. So that allow us to reach the staff level agreement. During the discussions that we have in this review, of course, we discussed the 2021 budget, and we also discussed and took a stock of the recent economic development and also the reforms that have been undertaken by the authorities.
Okay, so let's go step by step through the statement that you already released, and we also received it, of course. So growth outlook for 2021 is down from 5% to 4.3%. And let me read you out what Finance Minister told us before you released the statement. He said we would call the year 2021 a post-COVID era to further stimulate the economy, but unfortunately that did not happen. Therefore, we will have the same budget philosophy as in 2020, which provides partial compensation and mitigation of the current damage the COVID will inflict on us daily, but at the same time, some incentive components. So this is the statement from our Finance Minister, Ivane Machavariani. In your statement that you released, I read that the prompt social and economic response of the authorities has helped contain the economic and social impact of the pandemic. I have the question, what are the main parameters that the IMF is looking at from the economic and social impact that where you think authorities have been effective?
So let me start by noting what was discussed in the previous review and was approved in the amendment budget at the end of June. At the time that the shock was hit the world, we discussed support measures amounting to about 4% of GDP, and there was a combination of supports to households in the form of, you know, subsidies for wages, tax incentives to keep people employed, and also transfers to support those that were working in the informal sector, including that. Additional measures were put in place to support families with children, to support those to pay university fees, for example, for most vulnerable families, but also some measures were included to support the business. So there is a tax relief, property tax relief for the tourism sector, hospitality sector, and the credit guarantee scheme was redesigned to help give access to credit to small and medium enterprises. So this is a package that was approved in 2020. It has been implemented along the year, and the philosophy that we have when we were discussing the 2021 budget was that there is so much uncertainty in the environment about the recovery that continued support will be needed for next year. So some of these measures will be extended next year, and that will give time for people to sustain incomes or to support income while the economy gets recovered.
Yes. Back to my question. What are some of the main parameters of the economic and social impact that you think that the authorities have dealt effectively?
This is a shock like no other. So we are seeing that, with the support of the authorities, both from the side of the NBG and also from the side of the Ministry of Finance, policy support has been able to mitigate the impact of the shock on the economy. We are seeing that the growth will be -5% estimated this year. The impact could have been higher if we didn't have the support of the public demand, or the NBG, the central bank, will not have provided liquidity support. We are monitoring also the unemployment statistics, and we are seeing that formal unemployment is being sustained, and that in part is due to the tax incentives that were provided to companies in order to maintain people on the job on a temporary basis.
From this standpoint, looking at 5% projection first and then 4.3 projection now, would you say that the IMF was a little bit too optimistic about how would Georgia deal with the pandemic?
So, let me start. We change our projections depending. We try to give the best projection that we can, given the information that we have. I think that what it shows, the dynamic revision of projections, is that there is a lot of uncertainty in the current environment. And as we get additional information, we try to give our best projection. We don't wait. We are trying to be proactive. I have to say that from the projection that we have of 5% in the World Economic Outlook in October 2020 to the revision that we have now of 4.3% growth next year in 2021, there are two main elements that we have incorporated. First is we have now data to assess the full impact of the lockdown in the second quarter of this year. Yeah, and that helps to update our projection this year. That has an impact on our projection next year. We also know that the shock is going to be longer than we initially projected. Initially, there was a lot of uncertainty, but we were working with the assumption that the shock will be of a V shape. Now we know that it's a more protracted shock, that the impact of the shock will be longer, and it will impact 2021 also. And then the third element is that we have seen a significant surge in COVID-19 cases in Georgia. We are not assuming at this stage any nationwide lockdowns, but that increase in COVID-19 cases will impact consumption and investment patterns. So that will carry into a little bit of a deterioration of the outlook in 2021.
Yes, since you mentioned lockdowns several times, and it is impossible to avoid this word in these uncertain times, and during the pandemic, like the disruptions to the economy caused by the problem in health, which is something that the world hasn't known before to this extent. But from this standpoint, and I asked this question to Mr. Jihad Azur. I had an interview with him last week, and he didn't answer it directly. So I'm asking you now whether or not I will get a direct answer. Is that how do you assess our government's decision to a more, so to say, fuller lockdown on the early stage of pandemic, when we had just a few cases of COVID-19, and now this surge, also country losing the green status, so to say, without having the time to capitalize on it in terms of tourism recovery or economic recovery.
So regarding the lockdown that was imposed in the spring of 2020, we thought that the authorities were very proactive in taking measures to limit the expansion of the COVID-19 cases. And what we saw is that the number of cases in Georgia remained subdued, while in neighboring countries they were significantly increased, right? So that limit the social impact of the shock. It allowed to keep the number of cases manageable. There were not put significant pressures on the health system in Georgia. And I think it even allowed to do the reopening of the economy starting in June, right? So it was quite effective in my view. Now, what we are seeing is that now there is a significant surge in the COVID-19 cases, but we have also learned that the fatality rate of the pandemic is much weaker. So with social distancing, with face masks, we know that there are ways also to limit contagion of the pandemic. Whether a future lockdown is going to happen or not, that I cannot give you an answer, because I cannot give you. I think that, of course, the authorities have been very proactive in implementing tracking of the cases. We are seeing them being very proactive in addressing the additional health spending that is required with the increase in the cases. And what I can tell you now is that in our growth projections and in the economic impact, we don't foresee at the moment a nationwide lockdown.
Yes, I understand, and that's a very encouraging answer there. Current account deficit will reach 9.7% of GDP, and fiscal deficit is also rising. How did the government assure you, Ms. Martin, that this is not a stretch for a quite poor country like Georgia, and in such tough situation, and not only Georgia, also global economy, since we're talking about Georgia, that is a small economy, it's open economy, it's very interdependent on what's going on around it.
Yes, that's a very good question. So we have Georgia is a small open economy vulnerable to external shocks. So when we were assessing the impact of the shock on the Georgian economy, we were expecting a widening in the current account deficit, mainly because travel stops, and Georgia is a tourism-dependent economy. Mm-hmm. It has been a great source of growth in the last years, and with social distancing and the ban on international flights, there was no other way that tourism coming to a standstill, and that is going to have an impact. I have to say at the same time that the impact on the current account deficit has been milder than what we originally projected, in part because there have been an adjustment in the trade balance. Import growth had remained subdued because of domestic demand. Mm-hmm. And that has compensated more than the slowdown that we have seen in export growth. And remittances have also sustained the levels. Actually, they have been doing relatively well, and they are growing year on year by single digits, but it's still growing. We didn't expect that when we first thought about the impact of the shock. So there is a widening in the current account deficit, and what we are seeing is that it has generated additional external financing needs. Mm-hmm. In response to that, we augmented the IMF program, we provided more financing, and the authorities have been able to mobilize also donor financing from other multilateral and bilateral institutions. Mm-hmm. I think in terms of the widening of the deficit, the message we have been giving globally to our membership is, if you have fiscal space, use it, because the shock is so unprecedented that you want to limit the impact in the economy and socially, so that when the pandemic fades, your recovery becomes quicker. So there are trade-offs about what you can do now and what you will have in the future. And I think it's important to recognize that Georgia has been in this position that have been able to mobilize finance. It has fiscal space to widen the deficit. And of course, this cannot be maintained on a permanent basis, because then you will face a challenge with fiscal sustainability. But there is a Georgian fiscal rule that also tells the authorities, okay, you can deviate from your fiscal parameters on a temporary basis when you are in an emergency situation. And it also tells you how you have to go back. So in terms of fiscal sustainability, we know that the deficit has to be 3% of GDP, the debt has to be 60% of GDP by 2023. So there are strong commitments. It's legislation. It's accountable to the Georgian legislation that fiscal sustainability in the future will be preserved.
Yes, that is a very interesting phrase. I have also noted down that phrase when you say that public debt under 60% of GDP by 2023. What does that mean? Do you envision that this debt at some point might overcome the 60% threshold?
So we are projecting that the public debt, gross public debt, and I'm going to elaborate on that, gross public debt will reach 62% next year. And this is driven by two elements. The first one, 3/4 of the public debt is denominated in foreign exchange, mostly in dollars and euros, and the depreciation of the lari increased the level of the debt. Then the second element is that the financing that have been mobilized by the authorities in order to respond to the shock. So there is a higher contraction of the debt in 2020 and in 2021. So debt is projected at 62% in 2021. By 2022, we are projecting that the public debt will be below 60% already. And one thing to note here is that, the increase in the debt doesn't fully translate in increasing spending. I mean, the government is also building deposits.
What is this, the structure of this debt? Is it, do you mean like totally new debt under that, or the debt that, for example, Georgia needs to cover in near future as well? What is the structure of this 62%?
So the structure of this debt is mostly multilateral and bilateral debt. And this is a debt usually at low maturities and low interest rate. There is some commercial debt. I mean, there is the government has a Eurobond in the market, and that is maturing in April 2021. And there is some part of the commercial debt. Then you have domestic debt, which is the government issuance of treasury bonds in the local capital market. So this is the composition of the debt. What we notice is that, since there is a higher reliance on multilateral and bilateral debt, the maturity of the public debt has been extended, and there is, in terms of the profile of the debt service, we have assessed it as manageable.
Since you mentioned this 500 million in Eurobonds next year, has the Ministry of Finance indicated in any way how they are going to deal with it and how they are going to refinance it?
So this is a 500 million Eurobond that is maturing in 2021. At the moment, the plans of the authorities is to roll it over. That will help to build fiscal buffers and also preserve external buffers in case downside risk materialize.
And now we get to the sustainability of the debt, including what you just mentioned, and then I will elaborate a little bit on lari exchange rate as well. So how sustainable it is?
So we assess the debt level as sustainable, and what we are projecting is that the level of the debt will be declining over the medium term, and that will be driven by the fact that the fiscal consolidation to comply with the fiscal rule will need to be accomplished by 2023.
And is it what needs to be the main source for helping government to adhere to the rule that is demanded by the law?
So there is a need to do fiscal consolidation. So you will need to reduce the deficit, and that will put less pressure on getting new debt in the future. We also see that as the economy recovers, the support measures that have been in place, they are of a temporary nature. So the spending will be significantly reduced. And as the economy recovers, we also expect revenues to recover.
Yes,
So,
yeah, of course. I'm just asking this question because, for example, for tourism recovery, you have, for the full recovery of the tourism, so to say, you have already set the date. It's 2024. So that's still not that V-shaped recovery that we all anticipated. Yes, so that's the logic behind my question.
No, I see. But what we are seeing is that once the effect of the pandemic fades, and under our assumption globally, the IMF is assuming that everything will be put in place by the middle of 2021, vaccine will be globally accessible by the end of 2022, we will see a recovery in economic activity, which will be driving external demand and then also domestic demand. So actually, from 2022, we still keep our medium-term growth projections to pre-shock level, and those hinges on the recovery in the global economy, but also undertaking and implementation of structural reforms that will help continue improving the competitiveness of the Georgian economy.
Ms. Martin, when you are making these projections, are you thinking about the vaccine as well? Because it now seems that nothing else but vaccine is something that might diminish this rate or the degree of the uncertainty that we have. This could work well for tourism, this could work well for FDI, everything that could work for Georgia, considering the structure of Georgia's economy to shrink this deficit.
So, I mean, the vaccine will make us going back, if we can say, to normal, right?
Yes.
I think it will be very difficult to normalize travel or to have people adventure and travel as we were doing before. And I hope we go back quickly to travel. But vaccine will resolve very much any of the concerns that people have to travel at the moment. And what that get resolved, what we think is, we are projecting tourism to recover. We didn't want to be too optimistic about that, so we have a protracted shock on tourism. There may be upside risk to the tourism outlook, because if the vaccine comes and it gets before we are expecting it, and people want to travel, and people will be selective in the places where they travel. So good health systems, limited number of cases, that could help also the tourism sector to recover. But definitely, I think vaccine will be a game changer in how we see the global economy evolving.
Yes, definitely. Yes. Back to the debt increase. You mentioned that there is quite uncertainty that this debt might translate into spending right away or not, and be left in the deposits. So this is also some kind of pressure on lari and the exchange rate, which in turn increases the debt as well. So in the statement that you issued, I read a very interesting phrase. You said keeping inflationary expectations anchored may call for tightening the monetary policy stance should pressures on lari exchange rate feed into expectations. Right now, what we are seeing is that inflation is coming down on the one hand. On the other hand, we see that NBG is still selling reserves, and on the third hand, we see that it is reluctant from easing the monetary policy. So very tough situation to see, to say the least. What is more important at this stage? Stability of lari and the exchange rate, or the inflation?
So let me start by recognizing it's a very challenging situation.
Yes.
But we have to keep in mind that the monetary framework of Georgia is inflation targeting. So
yes, of course.
And the floating
in this situation.
Yes, and the floating exchange rate regime has been working well for Georgia, because as a small open economy that is vulnerable to external shock, the exchange rate is helping to protect the economy from that shock.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
I mean, of course, I understand that people and households and companies, business who have borrowed in dollars are facing some pressures or reduced capacity to the burden on repaying those liabilities is increasing with the lari depreciation. But the fact that the lari adjusts is overall a positive development for the Georgian economy. Then the intervention of the central bank is more to limit the volatility rather than to stabilize the exchange rate. So you don't want an exchange rate that is too volatile, because volatility is also not good for the economy. So I think at the moment the challenge is you want inflationary expectations to remain well anchored around the 3% target of the central bank. And there are two elements here. One is the demand in the domestic economy that remains weak, and that is not putting pressures on inflation, right? So as long as the demand remains subdued, we will not see pressures on the exchange, on inflationary expectations coming from demand. It's not an economy it has inflation because of demand pressure, overheating in the economy. Actually, we have estimated a negative output gap that will only close in 2022. The second element that it drives inflation dynamics in Georgia is the exchange rate dynamics. And of course, a nominal effective depreciation of the exchange rate impact inflation because of the pass-through. And there is a rapid pass-through between exchange rate and inflation dynamics. So the NBG, in keeping the policy rates with a little bit of what we call a tightening bias, is helping to anchor those inflationary expectations in light of the recent depreciation of the lari, so that it doesn't fit into inflation. And what we are projecting is that inflation will actually converge to the 3% target by the end of 2021.
Yes. Are there any, so to say, policy measures that could be in place other than selling the reserves? Because we now see that it's over 700 million that is already sold.
So, I mean, there are measures that you can implement in order to increase lari financing, and I think extending long-term lari financing will allow to put less pressures on the exchange rate. That will require less reliance on foreign exchange, deepening the local capital market, allowing for facilities from the central bank that provide lari liquidity long term. And then overall, you have reducing economic volatility will be good, I think, to build confidence in the economy and to build confidence in the currency. And for
Yes,
that, sustaining competitiveness of the Georgian
yeah,
economy.
so that leads to the structural reforms that you have highlighted
Yes.
from time to time to time.
Yes.
and I guess we will have some of it in the next program. We have it as well. One more question that is like lingering. I mean, what happens if the pandemic is longer and if the government cannot deliver on what it projects will help to shrink the current deficit and to repay the debt that it has right now, because that 62% is not an easy figure for Georgia.
No, of course, it's not an easy figure, but the situation is not easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you will only be in these situations because you are facing very exceptional circumstances, right? So, of course, what we want to see is once the shock fades, you start consolidating on the fiscal. So reducing the deficit, reducing spending. The way we formulated the authorities have formulated the fiscal measures are only temporary. So they will not linger over time. And that will facilitate fiscal consolidation. With the recovery in growth and with the structural reforms that promote diversification, we project to see also a narrowing of the external imbalances and a narrowing of the external account deficit. So, that will also help to recover the level of revenues that for the fiscal authorities.
Ms. Martin, what does IMF think of the soundness of the banking sector in Georgia? Because since we do not have a capital market that's functioning to the full extent, I would put it that way, access to financing comes through the banking sector. What are some of the risks, some of the opportunities? What is the picture there?
Yeah. So what we are seeing in discussing also with the central bank is that the build-up of buffers in the financial sector before the shock has helped the financial sector to absorb the shock in a relatively mild way. So what we are seeing is that the capital buffers have been used, that provisioning has been allowed. So let's say that the financial sector seems to be in a good shape to absorb the shock.
Sorry to interrupt you, Ms. Martin, but Fitch Ratings told us that this approach from the Georgia Central Bank was quite unique vis-a-vis what other central bankers did and decide on building up these reserves during this pandemic.
Indeed, it was, but it proved to be quite appropriate. And of course, nobody projects a shock like this, but it's good that the financial sector was ready to absorb the first wave of the shock, and the response of the financial sector, of the banking sector in Georgia, and also in collaboration with the NBG, has been quite positive. Now I think, now we still need to see what is the impact of how the economy recover and how the loan moratoriums are not going to be impacted. Yes. We are seeing, for example, the banking sector being very proactive at restructuring some of the loans and providing some space to households and business in terms of extending maturities. The authorities also implemented the mortgage subsidy that helps to bring credit into the economy. And here, what you want to sustain is a financial sector that continues to support growth in the economy during the recovery. So capital adequacy remains there. So credit can continue flowing into the economy. And actually, during 2020, what we are seeing is that credit growth has been sustained. We were projecting a much stronger contraction in credit growth, and that's good. That means that there is still opportunities, and people are looking at credit conditions to invest. So this is a positive development. I think the NBG, together with the banks, are very proactive at implementing and monitoring financial risk and assessing possible different scenarios about what can happen with credit quality and how the banking sector is going to respond to that. So I think this unique formulation ahead of the pandemic help in a way to sustain credit growth during this year.
And my two last questions, pre-last, is that, and thank you for your time very much. Finance Minister's one more quote is that when he was talking that the government has reached an agreement with the International Monetary Fund on the budget parameters for 2021, not only on macro indicators such as the budget deficit, economic growth rate, inflation, etc., but also on what the structure of the 2021 budget should be. Could you please elaborate a little bit on that? What were some of the main recommendations that you had regarding the structure of the budget 2021?
That is a very good question, Elena. So when we discuss the deficit, I mean, actually, the deficit is the last thing we discuss. We usually discuss every line of the budget, and we discuss the revenues also with the outlook that we have on the economic recovery. So we have discussed the projection on the revenues. We have discussed with the authorities the need to sustain VAT refunds, and they will be increasing VAT refunds next year, which we think is a good way to support business and households. Then among the different measures in the spending side, we are sustaining some of the temporary measures that the authorities implemented this year in order to support households and business. So we'll keep social transfers to households that have been hit by the shock, that remain vulnerable. We are going to maintain some of the wage subsidies to be able to sustain people at jobs. And then we are also continuing with the credit guarantee scheme, which we think it will be a good way to sustain access to finance for small, medium enterprises. Overall, the package on the spending side that has been discussed is of about 2% of GDP. But we thought that you cannot go from support in 2020 of 4% of GDP, more or less, to zero support next year in an environment that is so uncertain about how the recovery and domestic demand will behave on the way to the recovery next year.
Yes, that is so understandable. Also, the reviews are always very positive. So just to peek into the behind the scenes, what were some of the most challenging parts of the review where discussions where it spurred these discussions?
So, I mean, look, if you look at the time of the mission, it has been almost 5 weeks. And one of the challenges was that we were doing a remote virtual mission.
Yes.
Like, unfortunately, we need to do this. It's a pity that we are not in Tbilisi. It's a pity that we could not travel to Tbilisi and be there. And the time difference doesn't work to our advantage. So you have a limited time of meetings. When we are in Tbilisi, we can meet endless hours. When we are with a 9-hour difference, it's very difficult to find common reasonable times where we can meet. So that stretched the mission. But in terms of the challenging discussions, I think the most important thing was we have a very challenging environment. And it's not that we have a lot of differing views about what needs to be done. It's mostly that the environment is very difficult to predict. There is so much uncertainty that just coming to an understanding about how do we see the economy, what is the pace of the recovery, how do we see the risks to that baseline, and then once we get to that, discussing, of course, the 2021, the parameters of the 2021 budget is also challenging. So how much support do you provide to the economy? How much support you can afford? What are your debt dynamics going? How are you going to sustain a little bit of the support that the economy needs, but without threatening fiscal medium-term sustainability? And how do you make sure that, okay, you sustain the support next year, but you also start doing some fiscal consolidation because you know that your fiscal rule will bring you to a 3% deficit. And you don't want to adjust all in 1 year because that will withdraw a lot of public demand. So calibrating the policy mix and how that, you think about the support the economy, how do you calibrate the fiscal policy, how fiscal and monetary policy need to complement each other and being fully coordinated. And then finally also how flexible you have to be, because the environment is so uncertain that if conditions change, you will need to recalibrate your policy mix. So it's that the situation is very challenging and you want to cover all the possible scenarios. You cannot do it one by one, but you have to have a common understanding about how the policy mix will evolve next year.
And my last question about the context, this is purely Georgian context right now, after elections, protests, that unfortunately went to the streets, which is an added factor to the uncertainty that both of us have been mentioning during this quite long interview, quite detailed interview, and thank you again for that. So what is your take on that?
So, uncertainty in an environment of excessive or pervasive uncertainty could increase economic volatility, could bring some questions about the recovery or the pace of recovery of the economy. And there is a need to take these elements into account in order to ensure that, you minimize the impact of uncertainty on the economic parameters.
As I knew, you took it to the economic. Of course. Thank you so much for being with us and taking our questions. And I will be waiting for that document after the review, because there I get to know not only what IMF thinks and plans, but also what my government plans and things, which is very useful. And thank you for that again. Thank you for taking.
Thank you very much, Alain. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.